Wyoming Territory, 1878. The setting sun painted the wide prairie in hues of amber and gold as dust swirled around the lone rider approaching Sweetwater Creek. Luke Sinclair sat tall in his saddle, the leather creaking beneath him as his chestnut gelding picked its way down the rocky slope. At 26, Luke had already seen enough of the West's unforgiving nature to convince him that a man was better off alone. "Easy there, Thunder," he murmured, patting the horse's neck as they navigated the steep terrain. The dying light caught the thin white scar running from his temple to his jaw, a permanent reminder of the time he'd trusted the wrong person. Luke had been riding for the Diamond R Ranch for nearly 4 years now, making a respectable living as a cattle hand. The owner, Tom Richardson, treated him fair, and the work suited a man who preferred the company of horses to people. His fellow cowhands knew better than to press him about his past or why he never joined them on their rowdy trips into town. Some called him standoffish behind his back, others labeled him arrogant. The truth was simpler and sadder. Luke had learned the hard way that connections meant vulnerability, and vulnerability got a man killed in the unforgiving Wyoming wilderness. The 26-year-old cowboy wasn't much for fancy dress, but even in his worn denim and faded blue shirt, his handsome features drew attention. Tall and lean with sun-bronzed skin, deep blue eyes, and wheat-colored hair, Luke could have had his pick of admirers in Sweetwater if he'd been so inclined. A light stubble typically covered his strong jawline by day's end, giving him a rugged appearance that belied his youth, but Luke kept to himself, convinced that the West was no place for sentiment. Love was a luxury he couldn't afford, not when survival demanded his full attention. As he reached the bottom of the hill, Luke spotted the ranch house in the distance, lamplight glowing from its windows. Richardson had called all the hands back early from the northern pastures. Rumor was that changes were coming to the Diamond R, though no one knew exactly what. Luke cared little for ranch gossip, so long as he kept his job and his solitude. What he didn't know as he approached was that Tom Richardson's niece had arrived from Boston the previous day, and that her presence would soon challenge everything he believed about himself and his carefully constructed isolation. The next morning, the bunkhouse buzzed with speculation about the young woman who had arrived at the main house. Luke ignored the chatter as he pulled on his boots and hat, determined to focus on the day's work rather than Richardson's family matters. "Heard she's pretty as a picture," said Joe, one of the younger hands, "come all the way from Boston." "Pretty or not, what's a city girl gonna do out here?" another cowboy replied. "Bet she hightails it back east before the month is out." Luke said nothing as he stepped outside into the cool morning air. The sky was just beginning to lighten, promising another clear day. He headed toward the corral to begin his tasks, hoping to avoid whatever commotion the visitor might bring. He was checking a saddle strap when Tom Richardson's booming voice called across the yard, "Sinclair. Need you over here." Luke looked up to see the ranch owner standing on the porch of the main house, waving him over. With reluctance, he set down his work and crossed the yard. "Yes, sir," he asked, removing his hat as he approached. Richardson, a burly man with a silver-streaked beard, clapped him on the shoulder. "Got someone for you to meet. My niece arrived yesterday from back east. Olivia, this here's Luke Sinclair, best horseman on the Diamond R." Luke turned to find himself looking into the most striking pair of hazel eyes he'd ever seen. Olivia Daniels stood on the porch, her honey-blonde hair swept into a practical bun at the nape of her neck. At 22, she had the refined bearing of Eastern society, yet there was something refreshingly direct in her gaze as she assessed him. She wore a simple traveling dress of deep blue that complemented her fair complexion, the fabric modest but clearly of fine quality. "Pleased to meet you, Mr. Sinclair," she said, extending her hand. Luke hesitated before accepting it, surprised by the firmness of her grip. "Ma'am," he replied curtly. "Olivia is going to be staying with us for a good while," Richardson explained. "Her father, my late brother's affairs back east are settled, and she's decided to make a fresh start here." Luke nodded, unsure why this information concerned him. "Thing is," Richardson continued, "she brought her own horse thoroughbred from back east. Fine animal, but not used to our terrain. I need someone to show her the safer riding trails, get both her and the horse accustomed to the land." Luke stiffened. "Sir, with all due respect, I've got the north herd too." "Already reassigned that to Matthews and Dawson," Richardson cut in. "This is important, Sinclair. Can't have my niece getting lost or hurt because she doesn't know the territory." Luke looked at Olivia, expecting to see the typical entitlement of an Eastern lady, who viewed ranch hands as servants. Instead, he found her watching him with a thoughtful expression. "I understand if you have more pressing duties, Mr. Sinclair," she said. "I wouldn't want to impose." Something in her tone, the absence of presumption, caught him off guard. "No imposition, ma'am," he found himself saying, "just unexpected." Richardson smiled broadly. "That's settled then. You'll start tomorrow morning, show her the basics of Western riding and the safer trails." As Luke walked back to the corral, he felt a strange unease. He'd carefully constructed his life to avoid entanglements, especially with women, and now he was assigned to be a riding companion to Richardson's eastern niece. It was precisely the kind of complication he didn't need. What Luke couldn't have known was that Olivia Daniels carried her own burdens and beliefs. Having fled a broken engagement and social scandal in Boston, she had come west not just for a fresh start, but to escape the painful whispers and judgment of society. Like Luke, she had learned to guard herself against vulnerability, though for very different reasons. The following morning dawned clear and bright. Luke waited by the stable, checking and rechecking his mount's tack to keep his hands busy. When Olivia appeared, he was surprised to see her dressed not in the fashionable riding habits of Eastern ladies, but in a practical split skirt and simple blouse, her honey-blonde hair braided and tucked beneath a wide-brimmed hat. "Good morning, Mr. Sinclair," she greeted him with a small smile. "I hope I haven't kept you waiting." "Just arrived myself," he lied, not wanting to admit he'd been there for nearly half an hour. "Your horse is saddled and ready." She approached the elegant bay thoroughbred, running a gloved hand along its neck. "Hello, Penny," she murmured. The horse nickered softly in recognition. Luke observed her with grudging approval as she checked the saddle and bridle herself before mounting with practiced ease. Perhaps she wasn't the helpless society girl he'd assumed. "You've ridden before," he commented as he swung into his own saddle. "Since I was 6, she replied, "though mostly in parks and on groomed trails. I understand the terrain here presents different challenges." Luke nodded. "We'll start easy today. Follow the creek for a spell, get your horse used to the rocky ground." They rode in silence for the first mile, Luke occasionally pointing out landmarks or potential hazards. He kept his instructions brief and professional, determined to maintain distance despite the unexpected ease of her company. As they followed the creek into a small valley dotted with cottonwoods, Olivia finally broke the silence. "You don't much care for this assignment, do you, Mr. Sinclair?" The directness of her question surprised him. "My preferences don't matter. Your uncle gave an order." "That's not an answer," she observed quietly. Luke frowned. "No, I don't care for it. I work better alone, but it's nothing personal." She nodded, accepting his honesty without offense. "Well, I appreciate your time regardless, and I promise to be a quick study so I won't burden you long." Something in her tone, a genuine consideration for his feelings, caught Luke off guard. Most people didn't concern themselves with a ranch hand's preferences. "Your uncle mentioned you're staying for a while," he said, surprising himself by initiating conversation. "Most Easterners find Wyoming too rough for their liking." A shadow crossed her face. "I find Boston considerably rougher in its own way." The cryptic response piqued his curiosity despite himself, but Luke knew better than to pry. Everyone had things they preferred to keep private, himself included. They rode further, crossing the shallow creek and heading toward a ridge that offered views across the valley. As they climbed, Luke found himself impressed by how quickly Olivia adapted to the terrain, adjusting her weight in the saddle and giving her horse freedom to pick its footing on the rocky slope. At the ridge top, they paused to rest the horses. The landscape stretched before them, rolling grasslands, distant mountains, and the ribbon of Sweetwater Creek winding through it all. "It's beautiful," Olivia said softly, "so open and honest." "Honest?" Luke questioned, turning to look at her. She gestured to the wilderness around them. "The land doesn't pretend to be anything it's not, dangerous when it's dangerous, generous when it's generous, unlike people." The observation struck a chord in Luke. "That's why I prefer it to town," he admitted. Olivia studied him for a moment. "My uncle says you're the best horseman on the ranch, but you never join the others when they go into Sweetwater." Luke shifted uncomfortably under her perceptive gaze. "Nothing in town interests me." "Not even company?" she asked. "Conversation?" "Found most conversation ain't worth the trouble it brings," he replied, his hand unconsciously rising to the scar on his face. Olivia noticed the gesture but didn't comment on it. Instead, she said, "Then I'll try not to burden you with mine." As they rode back toward the ranch, Luke found himself strangely conflicted. Her lack of pretense and respect for his reticence had been unexpected. It was a rare quality that made maintaining his usual wall of indifference more difficult than he'd anticipated. Back at the stables as they unsaddled their horses, Olivia paused. "Thank you for today, Mr. Sinclair. When might we continue the lessons?" "Tomorrow, same time," he replied, focusing on his tack to avoid her eyes. "Weather permitting." She nodded and turned to leave, then hesitated. "Mr. Sinclair, I know this assignment wasn't your choice, but I truly do value your expertise. The West is new to me, and I'd rather learn from someone who respects its dangers than someone eager to impress." With that, she left him standing in the stable, unsettled by the simple gratitude and the realization that she had seen through the other ranch hands' offers to show her around, offers motivated more by her beauty than genuine helpfulness. That night, lying in his bunk, Luke found his thoughts returning to their conversation. Olivia Daniels was not what he had expected. There was a guardedness about her that mirrored his own, though for what reason he couldn't guess. It made her both more interesting and more dangerous to his carefully constructed solitude. "Just doing my job," he muttered to himself in the darkness. "Nothing more to it than that." But even as he said it, Luke knew something had shifted. For the first time in years, he found himself curious about another person's story. Over the next 2 weeks, their morning rides became a routine. What began as stiff, minimal conversation gradually evolved into a cautious rapport. Luke found himself pointing out not just potential dangers, but also the beauty of the landscape, the way morning light caught the dew on prairie grass, or how the cottonwood leaves turned silver when the wind rippled through them. One morning, as they paused to rest by a small pond, Olivia reached into her saddlebag and offered him a cloth-wrapped package. "Mrs. Harmon made biscuits this morning," she explained, referring to the ranch's cook. "I thought you might be hungry." Luke hesitated before accepting. "Thank you," he said, unwrapping a still-warm biscuit. The simple gesture of thoughtfulness caught him off guard. They ate in companionable silence, watching a pair of ducks glide across the pond's surface. Finally, Olivia spoke. "May I ask you something personal, Mr. Sinclair?" Luke tensed. "Depends on the question. Why do you stay out here? You clearly know horses better than anyone at the Diamond R. You could run your own stable in town, make a better living." Luke considered the question, surprised to find himself willing to answer. "Towns have too many people. Too many expectations. And too many memories," she suggested softly. He looked at her sharply. "What makes you say that?" Olivia met his gaze steadily. "Because I recognize the look of someone running from their past. I see it in my mirror every morning." The honesty in her admission disarmed him. "What are you running from, Miss Daniels?" She looked out across the pond. "A mistake. I trusted the wrong person, built my future on false promises." She absently twisted the riding glove on her left hand. "In Boston, a woman's reputation is her only currency. Once it's spent, there's little left." Luke found himself wanting to know more, to understand what had brought this refined young woman to the Wyoming wilderness. But before he could form another question, the distant rumble of thunder interrupted them. "Storm's coming," he said, rising to his feet. "We should head back." They mounted quickly and set off toward the ranch, but the Wyoming weather moved faster than anticipated. Within minutes, the sky darkened dramatically, and fat raindrops began to fall. "There's a line shack about a quarter-mile east," Luke called over the rising wind. "We can wait it out there." Olivia nodded, pulling her hat lower against the rain as they altered course. The rain quickly became a downpour, turning the trail slick and treacherous. Luke led them carefully through a stand of trees to a small clearing where a rough wooden cabin stood. He dismounted quickly, helping Olivia down before leading both horses to the lean-to attached to the cabin. Once the animals were secured, they hurried inside the shack. The interior was simple: a rough table, 2 chairs, a small stove, and basic provisions kept for just such emergencies. Luke quickly set about lighting the stove while Olivia stood dripping by the door. "There's a blanket on that shelf," he said, nodding toward a crude cabinet. "You should get out of that wet jacket." Olivia retrieved the blanket, turning her back politely as she removed her sodden outer garments. Luke kept his eyes fixed on the stove, giving her privacy as he coaxed the fire to life. How long do these storms usually last? She asked, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders and sitting in one of the wooden chairs. Hard to say. Could be an hour, could be all day. He gestured to the provisions. At least we won't go hungry. Olivia smiled. My uncle plans well. Been caught in enough Wyoming storms to know better than to risk it, Luke replied, finally looking at her directly. With her hair dampened by rain and coming loose from its braid, her cheeks flushed from the ride, Olivia looked younger and somehow more vulnerable than the composed young woman he'd come to know. A strand of honey-blonde hair clung to her cheek, and without thinking, Luke reached out to brush it away. He caught himself just before his fingers touched her face, pulling back as though burned. Sorry, he muttered, turning away to check on the fire. It's all right, she said softly. An uncomfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the drumming of rain on the cabin roof and the occasional rumble of thunder. Finally, Olivia spoke again. I was engaged, she said quietly, in Boston. Luke looked up, surprised by the sudden confession. He was from a good family, charming, well-connected. Everyone said I was fortunate to make such a match. Her voice held no self-pity, just a weary acceptance. What no one knew was that he had gambling debts, significant ones. Luke remained silent, sensing she needed to tell the story in her own way. He convinced me to sign papers giving him access to my inheritance, the money my father left me, said it was for our future home. She gave a hollow laugh. By the time I discovered the truth, half the money was gone and he'd fled to Europe with another woman. Left me with nothing but scandal and pity. Understanding dawned on Luke, so you came west. Olivia nodded. Uncle Tom was my father's only family. He wrote after hearing of my situation, offering a home here. She looked around the simple cabin. I think he expected me to refuse. Most Boston society women would have, but I found I couldn't bear the whispers and pitying glances anymore. That took courage, Luke said quietly. Leaving everything familiar. She looked at him with surprise. Most people call it running away. Sometimes running is the only sensible option, he replied, especially when staying means drowning. Their eyes met across the small cabin, and Luke felt a dangerous barrier within him beginning to crack. This woman understood something of loss and betrayal. She'd been wounded by trust misplaced, just as he had. The realization made her both safer and infinitely more dangerous to his carefully guarded heart. Your turn, Olivia said softly. Fair exchange. Luke touched the scar on his face unconsciously, not much to tell. Trusted the wrong person, nearly got killed for it. The scar, she asked. He nodded. 4 years ago, I was working a ranch near Cheyenne. Foreman there had a brother who ran with a rough crowd. They robbed the bank in town, needed somewhere to hide out afterward. Understanding dawned in Olivia's eyes. He brought them to the ranch. Right to the bunkhouse where I was sleeping. I woke up, saw men I didn't recognize with guns. Luke's voice grew distant with the memory. When the sheriff came looking, the foreman tried to silence me permanent. Got this instead. He traced the scar. Taught me a valuable lesson about trusting people. That one man's betrayal doesn't mean everyone will betray you, Olivia suggested. Luke shook his head. That trusting anyone is a risk not worth taking. A lonely conclusion, she observed quietly. Safer, he countered. The rain continued to drum on the roof as they fell into silence again. The small stove had warmed the cabin, creating a strange intimacy in the confined space. We all have scars, Mr. Sinclair, Olivia finally said. Some are just more visible than others. There was no pity in her voice, only understanding, and it touched something in Luke that had been closed off for years. Before he could respond, however, the rain began to slacken. Storm's passing, he said, moving to the window. We should head back before your uncle sends out a search party. The moment of connection passed, but as they prepared to leave the cabin, something had undeniably shifted between them. Luke found himself helping Olivia with her still damp jacket, their fingers brushing momentarily as he handed her the reins to her horse. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, but it was a different quality of silence, not strained but thoughtful, as though they were both reassessing their understanding of each other. As they approached the Diamond R, Olivia turned to him. Thank you for sharing your story with me today, Luke. It was the first time she had used his given name. Likewise, he replied, finding it strangely difficult to meet her eyes. Same time tomorrow, she asked as they reached the stables. Luke nodded, surprised to realize he was looking forward to it. Tomorrow, he confirmed, watching her walk toward the main house with a strange mixture of apprehension and anticipation taking root within him. He had spent 4 years avoiding connection, convinced that isolation was the price of survival in the unforgiving West. Now, he found himself questioning whether that belief was wisdom or simply fear disguised as caution. Over the following weeks, their morning rides extended longer, their conversations deepening beyond the cautious exchanges of strangers. Luke found himself sharing stories of his earlier years, growing up on a small farm in Missouri, learning horsemanship from his father, the wanderlust that had driven him west after his parents died. In turn, Olivia spoke of Boston, of art exhibitions and concerts she had enjoyed, but also of the stifling expectations placed upon women of her social standing. Out on the open prairie, far from judgmental eyes, she seemed to shed layers of Eastern reserve, revealing a quick wit and adventurous spirit that both surprised and intrigued Luke. One morning in late June, they rode to a high meadow carpeted with wildflowers. As they dismounted to rest the horses, Olivia wandered among the blooms, gathering a small bouquet. "My mother would have loved this place," she said, arranging the flowers in her hand. She always said the most beautiful gardens were the ones nature planted herself. Luke watched her move through the meadow, sunlight catching in her honey-blonde hair. She wore it in a single braid today, practical for riding but softer than her usual style. The sight stirred something in him he'd long thought buried, a quiet appreciation that went beyond mere acknowledgement of her beauty. "You're different than I expected," he admitted, the words slipping out before he could reconsider them. Olivia turned, curious. "How so?" Luke fumbled for the right words. "Most Eastern women who come west. They try to remake everything to match what they left behind. You seem to be embracing what's here." She considered this, twirling a wildflower between her fingers. "I came west to find something different," she said simply. "What would be the point in trying to recreate Boston?" Luke nodded, understanding more than she realized. They both sought something new, a clean slate away from past mistakes and painful memories. As they prepared to mount up again, a distant movement caught Luke's eye. He shaded his gaze, focusing on the ridge to the north. "What is it?" Olivia asked, noting his sudden alertness. "Riders," he replied, his voice tense, "coming fast." "Get on your horse." They mounted quickly, Luke's earlier ease replaced by vigilance. "We need to get back to the ranch," he said, scanning the terrain for the quickest route. "Who do you think they are?" Olivia asked, catching his concern. "Don't know, could be nothing." But his hand hovered near the revolver at his hip, suggesting otherwise. They rode at a brisk pace, taking a different trail than their usual route back. Luke kept checking over his shoulder, his body language communicating an urgency that Olivia picked up on without further questions. As they crossed a shallow ravine, the sound of hoofbeats growing louder behind them, Luke made a decision. "There's a stand of rocks ahead that provides good cover. We'll stop there, let them pass." They reached the outcropping, a jumble of boulders providing natural concealment, and dismounted quickly. Luke led their horses behind the largest rock formation, signaling Olivia to stay quiet. The riders appeared minutes later, 4 men, trail-worn and hard-looking, with the unmistakable bearing of those accustomed to living outside the law. They rode past without slowing, following the main trail toward Sweetwater Town. Luke released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Trouble," he murmured. "You recognized them?" Olivia asked. "Not specifically." "But I know the type." He glanced at her, weighing how much to say. "Men like that, traveling fast and armed heavy. They're not cowhands or homesteaders." "Outlaws," she said, the word lacking the romantic notion Eastern papers often attach to it. Luke nodded grimly. "We need to warn your uncle. The ranch should be on alert." They remounted and continued toward the Diamond R, taking a circuitous route to avoid any chance of encountering the riders again. As they rode, Luke found himself hyper-aware of Olivia's safety in a way that went beyond his assigned responsibility. The thought of those men anywhere near her stirred a protective instinct that surprised him with its intensity. When they reached the ranch, Tom Richardson was in the yard, directing the unloading of supplies from a wagon. His expression darkened as Luke reported what they'd seen. 4 of them, you say?" Richardson stroked his beard thoughtfully. "Could be the same bunch that hit the bank over in Rollins last week." "They were heading toward town," Luke said. "Might be planning to lay low or resupply." Richardson nodded. "I'll send word to Sheriff Collins. In the meantime, I want all hands to stay close to the ranch. No unnecessary trips to town." He looked at his niece. And your riding lessons will need to stay within sight of the ranch house for a spell, Olivia. She started to protest, but the seriousness in both men's expressions stopped her. I understand, she said instead. As Olivia headed to the main house, Richardson pulled Luke aside. Keep a special eye on her, Sinclair. These are the same men who have been rustling cattle from the Turner spread. They're desperate and dangerous. Luke nodded, understanding the unspoken concern. A young woman from a wealthy Eastern family would make a tempting target for ransom if the outlaws learned of her presence. That evening, Luke took his supper on the porch of the bunkhouse, his attention fixed on the main house where lamplight glowed in the windows. The other hands sensed his mood and gave him space, their usual card games and banter subdued by Richardson's warning about the riders. As darkness settled over the ranch, Luke caught movement on the main house porch, Olivia, stepping out for some air before retiring. Without conscious decision, he found himself crossing the yard toward her. "Evening, Miss Daniels," he said, stopping at the bottom of the porch steps. She smiled, genuine pleasure lighting her features at the sight of him. "Mr. Sinclair, I was just admiring the stars. They seem so much brighter here than in Boston." "Less competition from city lights," he replied, glancing upward, "though we should probably both be inside, considering." Olivia sobered. "Are they truly that dangerous?" "The men we saw." Luke weighed his answer, not wanting to frighten her unnecessarily, but unwilling to minimize the potential threat. "Men get desperate out here sometimes, makes them unpredictable." She nodded, accepting his assessment without the panic or vapors a stereotypical Eastern lady might display. "Then I'll be cautious, though I hate to think of being confined to the house and yard." "It won't be for long," Luke assured her. "Sheriff Collins is good at his job. Once those men move on, things will return to normal." Their eyes met in the lamplight spilling from the house windows, and Luke was struck by how quickly normal had come to include their daily rides together. The realization that he would miss their time alone on the range caught him off guard. "Well, good night then, Mr. Sinclair," Olivia said softly. "Thank you for your concern." "Luke," he corrected her, surprising himself. "You called me Luke during the storm. I prefer it." A smile touched her lips. "Good night, Luke." "Good night, Olivia," he replied, her name feeling strangely intimate on his tongue. As he walked back to the bunkhouse, Luke acknowledged the uncomfortable truth he'd been avoiding for weeks. Despite his best efforts to maintain distance, despite the hard-learned lessons of his past, he was developing feelings for Olivia Daniels that went far beyond the boundaries of their arrangement. And that made her presence in his life both a blessing and the most dangerous threat to his carefully constructed solitude he had ever encountered. 3 days passed with no sign of the riders. The ranch remained on alert, but without further incidents, the initial tension began to ease. Luke continued to accompany Olivia on shortened rides within sight of the ranch buildings, their conversations carrying the same ease despite the restricted boundaries. On the 4th morning, Richardson called Luke to the main house. "Sheriff Collins sent word," he explained. "Those men were spotted heading north toward the Montana Territory. Seems they were just passing through after all." Relief visible on his weathered face, he added, "You can resume the regular riding lessons with Olivia. She's been champing at the bit to get back to exploring." Luke nodded, ignoring the leap of anticipation in his chest at the prospect of having Olivia to himself again on the open range. "We'll stick to the safer areas for now, just to be cautious." The next morning dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect summer day that seemed to embody the freedom of the West. Olivia arrived at the stables earlier than usual, her excitement evident in her quick movements as she prepared her horse. "I thought we might ride to Willow Creek today," Luke suggested as they mounted up. "The water's running high from the mountain's snowmelt." Olivia agreed eagerly, and they set off across the grasslands, the Diamond R buildings soon disappearing behind them as they crested the first low rise. The feeling of openness after days of restriction brought a visible lightness to Olivia's bearing, and Luke found himself watching her more than the trail, captivated by the joy in her expression. They rode for nearly an hour, talking easily about the ranch, the upcoming cattle drive, and Olivia's growing competence with Western riding techniques. As they approached Willow Creek, the conversation turned to her future plans. "Uncle Tom has suggested I might stay permanently," she said as they dismounted by the creek bank. He's getting older, says he could use family around to help manage the ranch business. Luke felt a conflicting surge of emotions at her words, hope that she might remain in Wyoming, concern about what that might mean for his own carefully maintained emotional barriers. Would you want that? He asked, keeping his tone neutral as he secured the horses. Seems a far cry from Boston society. Olivia laughed softly. Boston society and I parted ways rather decisively, if you recall. She gazed across the creek, where wildflowers dotted the opposite bank. Besides, I've found I prefer the honesty of the West. People judge you by your actions, not your family connections or social standing. Not always, Luke cautioned. People carry their prejudices West same as their belongings. True, she acknowledged. But there's still more room to define yourself on your own terms. She looked at him directly. Don't you find that liberating? Before Luke could answer, the crack of a rifle shot echoed across the creek valley. Instinctively, he dove toward Olivia, knocking her to the ground and covering her body with his own as a second shot splintered the bark of a tree just above their heads. Stay down, he ordered, drawing his revolver as he scanned the ridgeline across the creek. Movement caught his eye, two riders silhouetted against the sky before they ducked back behind cover. The men from before, Olivia whispered, her body tense beneath his. Most likely, Luke assessed their situation with growing concern. They had little cover where they were, just a few trees and the slight depression of the creek bank. The horses, startled by the gunfire, had pulled their reins loose and bolted several yards away. Another shot kicked up dirt near their position. Luke made a swift decision. When I fire back, run for those boulders, he instructed, nodding toward a cluster of rocks 20 yards downstream. Stay low and don't stop. Olivia nodded, her face pale but determined. Luke raised himself slightly and fired 3 rapid shots toward the ridge, not aiming to hit but to provide covering fire. Olivia scrambled to her feet and ran, crouching low, toward the boulders. Luke followed close behind, firing once more before joining her behind the rocky shelter. They pressed their backs against the largest boulder, breathing hard. Are you hit? He demanded, quickly checking her for injuries. No, she assured him, remarkably composed despite the danger. What do they want? Nothing good, Luke replied grimly. He peered around the edge of the boulder, trying to get a better view of their attackers. The shooters had split up, one remaining on the ridge, while another had crossed the creek and was working his way toward their position from the west. We need the horses, Luke said, spotting the animals nervously pawing the ground about 50 yards away, but they've got us pinned down. Olivia followed his gaze, understanding the dire nature of their situation. Could we make it to that thicket? She asked, nodding toward a dense growth of brush and trees that offered a path toward where the horses had wandered. Luke weighed their options. Staying put would only allow the gunmen to surround them completely, but making a run for it exposed them to fire. We'll try for the thicket, he decided. But first, he shrugged out of his distinctive denim jacket and placed his hat on top of it, then carefully positioned them at the edge of the boulder to create the impression of someone hiding. Might buy us a few seconds of confusion. Olivia's eyes widened with understanding. Clever. On my count, Luke said softly, taking her hand. 1, 2, 3. They broke cover, running low and fast toward the thicket. A shout from the ridge confirmed their ruse had worked momentarily. The shooter had fired at Luke's jacket before realizing his mistake. They reached the thicket as bullets tore through the leaves around them, diving into the underbrush and crawling through the dense vegetation. Luke kept his body between Olivia and the direction of fire, hyper-aware of her ragged breathing and the warmth of her hand still clasped in his. When they reached the far side of the thicket, Luke cautiously raised his head to locate the horses. They had moved further away, still spooked by the gunfire. I'll go for the horses, he told Olivia. You stay hidden. She gripped his arm. That's suicide. They'll see you in the open. No choice, he replied. We can't outrun them on foot, and they're closing in. Before she could protest further, Luke squeezed her hand once, then sprinted from the cover of the thicket toward the horses. Gunfire erupted immediately, bullets kicking up dirt around his running figure. Olivia watched in horror as Luke zigzagged across the open ground, expecting any moment to see him fall. Instead, he reached the horses, grabbed both sets of reins, and vaulted into his saddle in one fluid motion. In seconds, he was galloping back toward her position, leading her mount. He didn't stop, just slowed enough to shout, "Run to me." Olivia burst from the thicket and ran with everything she had. Luke reached down as he approached, his strong arm catching her around the waist and swinging her up behind him on the saddle. They took off at a gallop, her horse following on the lead rope. Gunfire continued behind them, but growing more distant as Luke pushed his horse to its limits. Olivia clung to his waist, her face pressed against his back as they raced across the open prairie. Only when they had put considerable distance between themselves and their pursuers did Luke slow their pace to avoid winding the horses. He helped Olivia transfer to her own mount, his hands lingering at her waist to ensure she was steady. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice rough with concern and exertion. Olivia nodded, still catching her breath. "Yes, thanks to you." Her eyes met his, filled with gratitude and something deeper that made his heart race faster than their escape had. "We need to get back to the ranch," Luke said, forcing his attention back to their situation. Those men might still be following. They rode hard, taking a circuitous route back to the Diamond R. As they approached the ranch buildings, Luke could see unusual activity in the yard, several men on horseback, including Sheriff Collins with his distinctive badge catching the sunlight. Tom Richardson rushed to meet them as they rode in, his face lined with worry. "Thank God," he exclaimed, helping Olivia dismount. "We've been about to organize a search party." "What happened?" Luke demanded, noting the grim expressions on the other men's faces. Sheriff Collins stepped forward. "Bank in Sweetwater was robbed 2 hours ago. 3 men killed, including the teller." His eyes narrowed. "You two look like you've seen trouble yourselves." Luke quickly explained their encounter at Willow Creek, as Richardson ushered Olivia toward the house. The sheriff's expression darkened further. 4 men hit the bank," he said. "Sounds like you ran into 2 of them. They must have split up after the robbery, planning to rendezvous later." "They were shooting to kill," Luke said flatly. "Why target us?" Collins shook his head. "Wrong place, wrong time most likely. Or," he glanced toward the main house where Olivia had disappeared inside, "they might have recognized Richardson's niece. Word gets around, and a wealthy Eastern woman would make a valuable hostage if they're desperate enough." The thought chilled Luke to the bone. He had already suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made the danger seem even more acute. "We're organizing a posse," Collins continued. "Riding out within the hour. Could use a man with your tracking skills, Sinclair." Luke nodded, the decision immediate. "I'll be ready." As the sheriff moved away to confer with his deputies, Luke headed toward the main house. He needed to check on Olivia one more time before joining the posse. He found her in the sitting room, Richardson hovering nearby as the housekeeper brought her tea. When she saw Luke, Olivia stood immediately. "You're joining the posse," she stated, reading his intention in his stance. "Yes," he confirmed. "We need to make sure those men are caught before they harm anyone else." She crossed the room to stand before him, unmindful of her uncle's watchful gaze. "Be careful," she said softly. "You've already risked your life once today on my account." "And I'd do it again," Luke replied, the words escaping before he could censor them. Their eyes locked, a world of unspoken emotions passing between them. Richardson cleared his throat. "Sinclair, a word outside before you go." Luke nodded, reluctantly breaking eye contact with Olivia. "I'll be back," he promised her. Outside on the porch, Richardson fixed him with a penetrating look. "You saved my niece's life today. I won't forget that." "Just doing my job, sir," Luke replied automatically. Richardson shook his head. "We both know it's more than that." He studied Luke's face for a moment. "Olivia's special. Been through a lot, but still has a kind heart. I won't see that heart broken again." Luke understood the implicit question. "I respect her too much to cause her pain," he said carefully. "That's not what I asked," Richardson countered. "A man who respects a woman but doesn't love her should keep his distance. A man who loves her should declare himself honestly." Before Luke could respond to this unexpected directness, Richardson continued, "But that's a conversation for after you return. Go with the posse, help catch these killers. We'll talk when it's done." With a firm nod, he returned inside, leaving Luke standing on the porch with the uncomfortable realization that his feelings for Olivia were apparently obvious to everyone, perhaps even to himself. The posse rode out as the afternoon sun began its westward slide, 12 men including Luke, the sheriff, and his deputies. They tracked the outlaws north, following signs of 4 riders who had regrouped after the bank robbery. The trail led them into increasingly rough country, where pine forests and rocky ravines provided ample opportunities for ambush. As night fell, they made a cold camp in a sheltered draw, maintaining watches in shifts. Luke took the opportunity to check his ammunition and clean his revolver, his thoughts repeatedly straying to Olivia despite his efforts to focus on the task at hand. The image of her facing danger without panic, her trust in him during their escape, the feel of her arms around his waist as they rode to safety. These memories circled in his mind, challenging the beliefs he'd held so firmly since receiving the scar that marked his face and his outlook on life. "You're not much for conversation, are you, Sinclair?" observed one of the deputies, interrupting Luke's thoughts. "Never found much use for it," Luke replied, holstering his cleaned weapon. The deputy chuckled. "Man of action, then. Heard how you got Miss Daniels away from those shooters today. Pretty impressive." Luke shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. Anyone would have done the same. "Not necessarily," Sheriff Collins interjected, joining them by the small fire. "Takes a special kind of courage to put yourself in the line of fire for someone else." He studied Luke thoughtfully, the kind that comes from caring deeply. Luke remained silent, unwilling to discuss his feelings with these men, regardless of how perceptive the sheriff might be. Collins seemed to understand. "Get some rest," he advised. "Tomorrow will likely bring trouble." The sheriff's prediction proved accurate. They picked up the outlaws' trail at dawn, following it into a narrow canyon where the signs indicated the men had camped the previous night. As they cautiously advanced through the rocky passage, the first shots rang out from the cliffs above. The posse scattered for cover, returning fire at the barely visible figures on the ridgeline. One of the deputies took a bullet in the shoulder, and a rancher who had volunteered for the posse was grazed across the thigh. "They've got the high ground," Collins shouted over the gunfire. "We need to flank them." Luke, who had taken cover behind a large boulder, spotted a narrow game trail leading up the canyon wall. "I can get up there," he called to the sheriff, indicating the path. Collins nodded grimly. "Do it. We'll keep them occupied from here." Luke holstered his revolver and began the treacherous climb, using the sporadic gunfire to mask the sounds of his ascent. The trail was barely wide enough for a man's boot in places, with sheer drops to his right that promised certain death with a single misstep. He reached a ledge that ran parallel to the outlaw's position, crouching low to avoid detection as he worked his way closer. Through gaps in the rocks, he could make out 3 men firing down into the canyon. A fourth stood slightly apart, reloading a rifle. Luke drew his revolver and moved into position. He needed to time his attack perfectly. He would be outnumbered, with limited ammunition and nowhere to retreat if things went wrong. The decision was made for him when one of the outlaws turned, spotting his movement. Luke fired twice in rapid succession, hitting the man squarely in the chest. As the outlaw fell, Luke dove sideways as bullets tore into the rock where he had been standing. The remaining 3 men turned their attention to this new threat, giving the posse below the opening they needed. Sheriff Collins and his men opened fire from the canyon floor, catching 2 of the outlaws in the crossfire. The 4th man, the leader, judging by his confident bearing despite the chaos, darted behind a large boulder, returning fire with deadly accuracy. A bullet grazed Luke's arm as he sought better cover, the sharp burn barely registering through the surge of battle focus. The gunfight intensified, shots echoing deafeningly off the canyon walls. Luke worked his way around the perimeter of the outlaw's position, using the rocky terrain for concealment. When he had a clear angle on the leader's position, he took careful aim. The man rose to fire down into the canyon, exposing himself momentarily. Luke squeezed the trigger. His shot struck true. The outlaw leader staggered, dropping his weapon as he clutched his chest. He turned toward Luke, his face contorted with pain and rage, and Luke recognized him with a jolt of shock. The same man who had given him the scar 4 years earlier, the foreman's brother who had betrayed his trust and nearly killed him. Their eyes met across the rocky ledge, recognition dawning in the outlaw's gaze as well. With a final curse, he collapsed, his body tumbling over the edge to fall into the canyon below. The sudden silence that followed seemed unnaturally loud after the chaos of the gunfight. Luke stood slowly, his arm throbbing and his mind reeling from the realization that he had just killed the man whose betrayal had shaped his life for the past 4 years. "Sinclair, you alive up there?" Sheriff Collins called from below. "I'm here," Luke replied, his voice steadier than he felt. "It's over." The ride back to the Diamond R was subdued. They carried 1 dead deputy and 2 wounded men, along with the bodies of the outlaws tied across their horses. Luke's arm had been bandaged by one of the ranchers with medical experience, the wound painful but not serious. What occupied his thoughts, however, was not the physical injury, but the strange sense of closure that had come with the death of the man who had scarred him. For 4 years, Luke had carried the weight of that betrayal, using it to justify his isolation and mistrust. Now, faced with its sudden resolution, he found himself questioning the walls he had built. As they approached the ranch in the fading light of evening, Luke's thoughts turned to Olivia. The memory of her standing on the porch, asking him to be careful, gave him a sense of purpose that had been absent in his life for too long. Richardson and several ranch hands met the returning posse in the yard. The rancher's eyes immediately sought Luke, noting the bloodstained bandage on his arm with concern. "Just a graze," Luke assured him as he dismounted stiffly. "The outlaws." "All dead or captured," Sheriff Collins reported, dismounting beside him. "Thanks in no small part to Sinclair here. His actions turned the tide of the fight." Richardson nodded grimly. "Get yourself to the house," he told Luke. "Mrs. Harmon will see to that arm properly." Luke started to protest that the bunkhouse would suffice, but the determined look in Richardson's eye stopped him. With a nod, he handed his horse's reins to a stable boy and headed toward the main house. He had barely reached the porch when the door flew open and Olivia appeared, her face a mixture of relief and concern. Without hesitation, she rushed forward and embraced him, heedless of the dust and blood on his clothing. Luke stiffened momentarily in surprise before his arms came around her, holding her against him as though she were the most precious thing in the world, which, he was beginning to realize, she might well be. "You came back," she whispered against his chest. "I promised I would," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. She pulled back slightly, her eyes searching his face. "You're hurt." "It's nothing," he assured her. "Barely a scratch." Olivia didn't look convinced but stepped back, suddenly aware of their public embrace. A flush colored her cheeks as she glanced around, but the yard had tactfully emptied, Richardson having directed the posse members toward the bunkhouse where food and drink awaited. "Come inside," she said, composure returning to her voice. "Mrs. Harmon has water heating and supplies ready." In the kitchen, the motherly cook fussed over Luke's injury, cleaning and rebandaging it properly, while Olivia hovered nearby. When the wound was dressed to Mrs. Harmon's satisfaction, the cook excused herself, leaving them alone in the warm, lamplit room. An awkward silence fell between them, the physical and emotional exhaustion of the past 2 days catching up to both. "I should let you rest," Luke said finally, rising from his chair. Olivia stepped closer, stopping him with a gentle hand on his uninjured arm. "Luke," she said softly, "what happened out there?" He hesitated, uncertain how to explain the strange coincidence that had brought him face to face with his past. "We found the outlaws," he began. "There was a gunfight, but—" He took a deep breath. "The leader was the same man who gave me this." He touched the scar on his face, "the one who betrayed me 4 years ago." Olivia's eyes widened. "The same man, how is that possible?" "The West isn't as big as it seems sometimes," Luke said with a humorless laugh. "Especially for those living outside the law, their paths cross eventually." "What happened to him?" she asked quietly. "He's dead," Luke replied, the finality of it still sinking in. "By my hand." Olivia studied his face. "How do you feel about that?" It was a simple question, but one that cut to the heart of his confusion. "I don't know," he admitted. "For years I've carried this anger, this distrust, used it as a reason to keep everyone at arm's length, and now—" "Now that reason is gone," she finished for him. Luke nodded slowly. "But old habits are hard to break. I've been alone so long, I'm not sure I remember how to be anything else." Olivia stepped closer, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her hazel eyes. "You're not alone right now," she said softly. The simplicity of her statement broke something open inside him, a dam of emotion he had held back for too long. "Olivia," he began, his voice unsteady. "These past weeks, riding with you, talking with you, you've made me question everything I thought I knew about myself, about what I wanted." Her eyes never left his. "And what do you want now, Luke?" The answer came to him with sudden, crystal clarity. "A chance," he said. "A chance to see if there's more to life than just surviving, a chance to trust again." He hesitated, then added softly, "A chance with you." Olivia's smile bloomed slowly, transforming her face with a radiance that took his breath away. "I would like that very much," she replied. I came west looking for a fresh start, never imagining I might find something far more precious." Luke reached out, his calloused hand gentle as it cradled her cheek. "I can't promise I won't struggle with this," he warned. "Trust doesn't come easily to me anymore." "Nor to me," she reminded him. "We both carry scars, Luke. Perhaps together we can learn to see them not as warnings to stay apart, but as reminders of our strength." In the soft lamplight of the kitchen, with the sounds of the ranch quieting around them, Luke lowered his head and kissed her. It was a gentle kiss, tentative at first, then deepening as Olivia responded, her hands coming up to rest against his chest. When they finally parted, Luke rested his forehead against hers, a sense of peace settling over him that he hadn't felt in years. "I should go," he murmured reluctantly. "Your uncle will be wondering where I am." Olivia smiled. "I suspect Uncle Tom knows exactly where you are and approves wholeheartedly. He's been watching us for weeks." Luke chuckled. "He had some pointed words for me before I left with the posse, about respecting you but also being honest about my feelings." "Wise advice," Olivia said, her eyes twinkling. "And have you been honest, Mr. Sinclair?" He took her hand in his, marveling at how right it felt there. "I'm learning to be," he replied, "starting now." The summer faded into autumn, bringing with it the golden hues of changing aspens in the foothills and crisp mornings that promised winter's eventual arrival. On the Diamond R, the change of seasons brought the conclusion of the cattle drive and preparations for the colder months ahead. For Luke and Olivia, it brought something else, a deepening of the connection that had begun beside Willow Creek and solidified through danger and revelation. Their courtship progressed with a careful deliberateness that respected both their pasts. They continued their morning rides, though now they were punctuated by stolen kisses in hidden meadows and earnest conversations about their hopes for the future. In the evenings, Luke often joined Olivia and her uncle for supper in the main house, gradually becoming as much a part of the family as he was part of the ranch. Richardson observed their growing attachment with quiet approval. One evening in late September, he called Luke to his study after Olivia had retired for the night. "Sit down, son," he said, pouring 2 glasses of whiskey and offering one to Luke. "Been meaning to have a proper talk with you." Luke took the glass, a sense of nervous anticipation settling in his stomach. "About Olivia," he guessed. Richardson nodded, settling into his leather chair. "Partly. Also about the ranch." He took a sip of his whiskey, eyeing Luke over the rim of his glass. "I'm not getting any younger, Sinclair. Been thinking about the future of the Diamond R." "Sir?" Luke questioned, uncertain where this was heading. "You've proven yourself a dozen times over since you came here," Richardson continued. "Not just with horses, but with everything you put your hand to. The men respect you, and I've come to trust your judgment." He leaned forward in his chair. "I'm offering you the foreman position. Jenkins is retiring come spring, and I need someone who understands this place, someone who cares about its future." Luke stared at him, momentarily speechless. The foreman position was not just a job, but a recognition of trust and capability that far exceeded his expectations. "I'm honored," he finally said, "but why me? There are hands who have been here longer." Richardson chuckled. "Because you see this place the way I do, not just as a business, but as a home worth building and protecting." His expression grew more serious. "And because I've seen how you look at my niece. A blind man could tell you're in love with her." Luke didn't deny it. "I am," he admitted simply, "have been for months now." "And your intentions?" Richardson asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Honorable," Luke assured him. "I'd like to ask for her hand, with your blessing." He hesitated, then added, "But I wanted to be sure I could offer her a proper future first." Richardson laughed outright at this. "Son, Olivia has her own inheritance. She doesn't need a wealthy husband. She needs one who will treat her right, who values her mind as much as her beauty." His expression sobered. "Someone who'd risk his life for her without hesitation, as you've already proven willing to do." He raised his glass. "You have my blessing, Luke, and the foreman position. The two aren't conditional on each other, mind you. One's a matter of business, the other's a matter of family." Luke raised his own glass in response, a sense of profound gratitude washing through him. "Thank you, sir. I won't let you down on either count." As he left the study, Luke paused on the porch, looking up at the star-filled Wyoming sky. 4 years ago, bleeding and betrayed, he had vowed never to trust anyone again, convinced that the frontier was no place for connection. Now, standing on the threshold of a future brighter than anything he could have imagined, he marveled at how completely one woman's kindness had dismantled that belief. The following Sunday, Luke borrowed Richardson's buggy and took Olivia for a drive to a special spot he had discovered during his solitary explorations, a hilltop overlooking the entire valley, with the ranch buildings visible in the distance and the mountains rising majestically beyond. As they sat on a blanket spread over the autumn grass, sharing a picnic Mrs. Harmon had prepared, Luke found himself struggling to find the right words for what he wanted to say. Olivia, perceptive as always, noticed his distraction. "Is something troubling you?" she asked, her brow furrowing with concern. Luke shook his head, taking her hand in his. "Not troubling," he assured her, "just important." He took a deep breath, gathering his courage. "Olivia, when I came to Wyoming 4 years ago, I was convinced that the only way to survive out here was to depend on no one but myself. I believed that connections were weaknesses, that caring for someone meant making yourself vulnerable to pain." Her eyes softened as she squeezed his hand encouragingly. "Then you arrived," he continued, "and everything changed. Your kindness, your strength, your willingness to see beyond my walls, they challenged everything I thought I knew about myself and what I wanted from life." Luke shifted, turning to face her more directly. "I came to Wyoming looking for a place to hide from the world. Thanks to you, I found a place to belong instead." Reaching into his pocket, he withdrew a small box. "I can't offer you Boston society or the luxuries you grew up with," he said, opening it to reveal a simple gold band set with a small diamond. "But I can promise to love you every day for the rest of my life, to build a home and a future with you, if you'll have me." Tears gathered in Olivia's eyes as Luke took the ring and knelt before her. "Olivia Daniels, will you marry me?" "Yes," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "Yes, Luke Sinclair, I will marry you." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, Luke felt the last pieces of his old self, the wounded, mistrustful man who had arrived in Wyoming 4 years earlier, fall away completely. In their place stood a man transformed by love, ready to embrace a future he never thought possible. Olivia threw her arms around his neck, her lips finding his in a kiss that promised a lifetime of shared joys and challenges. When they finally parted, both breathless, she rested her head against his chest. "Do you know what first drew me to you?" she asked softly. "Beyond your handsome face and skill with horses." Luke shook his head, curious. "It was the kindness you tried so hard to hide," she said, looking up at him with a smile. "The way you would check my saddle twice before letting me mount, or how you always positioned yourself between me and potential danger on the trail. You thought your walls were impenetrable, but I could see the good man behind them from the very beginning." Luke kissed her again, marveling at how clearly she had seen him when he had been so determined to remain invisible. "Your uncle says we can build a house on the eastern section of the ranch," he told her. "As foreman, I'll need to be close to the main operations, but we'll have our own place." Olivia's eyes widened. "Foreman. When did this happen?" "He offered me the position 2 nights ago," Luke explained. "Jenkins is retiring in the spring." "That's wonderful," she exclaimed. "You'll be excellent at it." They spent the afternoon planning their future, the house they would build, the life they would share. As the sun began to sink toward the western mountains, painting the landscape in hues of gold and crimson, Luke realized that the West he had once seen as a place of lonely survival had transformed before his eyes into a land of possibility and promise. They were married in December, in a ceremony at the ranch that combined Olivia's Eastern refinement with Western practicality. The main house was decorated with evergreen boughs and red ribbons, a Christmas wedding that brought together the entire community, ranch hands, neighboring settlers, and even Sheriff Collins, who had become a friend following the outlaw incident. Olivia wore a gown of ivory satin that had been her mother's, adapted by the local seamstress to suit current fashion. Luke, unaccustomed to formal attire, nevertheless cut a handsome figure in a new black suit, his usual weathered appearance softened for the occasion. As they spoke their vows before the minister from Sweetwater, Luke looked into Olivia's radiant face and marveled at the journey that had brought them to this moment. From his first reluctant agreement to be her riding instructor to their shared future as husband and wife, every step had moved him further from isolation and closer to the connection he had once feared more than death itself. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the minister declared. "You may kiss your bride." Luke gathered Olivia into his arms, sealing their union with a kiss that drew appreciative cheers from the assembled guests. As they turned to face their friends and family, he caught Tom Richardson's eye. The older man raised his glass in silent toast, his weathered face creased with approval and affection. The celebration continued well into the evening, with music and dancing in the barn, transformed for the occasion with lanterns and decorations. As tradition demanded, Luke and Olivia shared the first dance, moving together with a natural harmony that spoke of their deepening connection. "Happy Mrs. Sinclair," Luke murmured as he guided her across the floor. Olivia's smile was answer enough, but she replied anyway, "Completely, and you, my husband." The word sent a thrill through him. "More than I ever thought possible," he admitted. "You've given me a life I never dared imagine." Later, as they slipped away from the celebration to the small cabin Richardson had prepared for them, until their own house could be built in the spring, Luke lifted Olivia across the threshold. The interior was simple but comfortable, warmed by a crackling fire and illuminated by the soft glow of lamplight. "Welcome home," he said softly, setting her on her feet but keeping his arms around her. Olivia looked up at him, her expression a mixture of love and wonder. "It's strange," she mused. "I came west thinking I was leaving everything behind, my past, my hopes, my dreams of family. Instead, I found everything I truly wanted was waiting for me here." "In the most unlikely person," Luke added with a smile. She reached up to trace the scar on his face, the mark that had once symbolized his distrust, now transformed into a reminder of how far he had come. "Not so unlikely," she contradicted gently, "just a good man who needed to remember how to trust again." As the snow began to fall outside, blanketing the Wyoming landscape in pristine white, Luke Sinclair held his bride close, profoundly grateful for the twist of fate that had brought Olivia into his life. The misunderstood young woman from Boston had seen beyond his carefully constructed walls to the heart of the man he could be, and her kindness had indeed changed his life forever. In the years that followed, as they built their home, welcomed children, and faced the challenges and joys of frontier life together, Luke never forgot the lesson he had learned that summer. That true strength lay not in isolation, but in the courage to open one's heart, even in a land as wild and unpredictable as the American West. The scar on his face faded with time, but the love that had healed his deeper wounds only grew stronger, a testament to how completely one woman's understanding and kindness had transformed a solitary cowboy's existence into a life rich with purpose and belonging.